Night pressed against the windows as the city hummed, and I traced a signal that refused to die. Jonathan Hale said, "If you exist, you left fingerprints." Static hissed like a stray cat along the dial, and the old spectrum lit with a jagged scar. He stacked clippings about the Black Knight, each headline a dare, each photo a taunt. Jonathan Hale said, "Myths rot when you hold them to light." A coded burst pricked the air and slipped away, as if embarrassed to be heard. He remembered a voice from childhood nights, a whisper that mapped the stars. Jonathan Hale said, "Come on, talk to me." The spectrogram bloomed, then collapsed, leaving a cold silence that felt theatrical. He smiled because silence is a kind of message. "Jonathan Hale," said someone is curating absence. The room smelled of coffee and dust, and the clock gave its patient verdict. The mystery felt awake and watching. The storm moved east, and the building settled like an animal finding sleep. Jonathan Hale said, "The gaps speak louder than the claims." He traced the signal path across oceans and deserts until the line fell off the map. A black satellite in old photographs grinned like a riddle with dental work. Jonathan Hale said, "You were catalogued, then erased." He opened a forum thread and found 10 dead links, and one that bit back. The file was a scan of a memo about foreign objects and friendly denial. Jonathan Hale said, "This was never meant for daylight." The memo named a launch that never launched and a tracking code that refused to belong. He checked the code and the code checked him. Jonathan Hale said, "So we are both being watched then." The room cooled, and the quiet felt negotiated. He rebuilt the signal like a skeleton from scattered bones and waited for it to stand. Jonathan Hale said, "If this is a hoax, it learned to breathe." The carrier returned at odd minutes, like a metronome with a limp. He fed it through an old decoder and found a lattice that whispered geometry. Jonathan Hale said, "You are not random." The lattice traced a sky path that brushed polar winds and cold seas. He plotted times and found birthdays and disasters hiding in the ticks. Jonathan Hale said, "Patterns borrow faces when they want attention." A chill threaded the spine of the apartment as the fridge murmured strange approval. He saved the file under a name he would not remember. Jonathan Hale said, "Tomorrow, I ask someone who will tell me not to." The night gave a small nod and dimmed. He crossed town to a quiet lab where skepticism kept the lights honest. Dr. Evelyn Cross met him with a look that measured, not judged. Dr. Evelyn Cross said, "You need sleep before you need answers." He laid out the printouts and let the silence weigh them. Jonathan Hale said, "Tell me where the trick hides." She traced the lattice and frowned at its stubborn symmetry. Dr. Evelyn Cross said, "If this is noise, it is disciplined beyond boredom." The word disciplined hung like a rule no one agreed to. She warned him that some signals lure you into your own reflection. Dr. Evelyn Cross said, "Be sure the face is yours when you look back." He promised caution, which felt like a costume. Jonathan Hale said, "I never wore it well." They checked public catalogs and found pages that had been carefully unmade. Dr. Evelyn Cross said, "These revisions are surgical." He watched the edit histories wear fresh fingerprints that belonged to no one. Jonathan Hale said, "A curator lives here." A private contact responded with a polite refusal that sounded pre-written. Dr. Evelyn Cross said, "Someone wants this question to expire." He searched for the name behind the refusal and met a wall that spelled influence. Jonathan Hale said, "We will go around the wall." The lab lights hummed in an even key, as if pleased with reasonable plans. A stranger's message arrived with a time and a street no one should trust. Dr. Evelyn Cross said, "You are not going alone." He nodded because promises travel better in pairs. The library basement smelled of iron and mildew, where knowledge hid from polite shelves. Jonathan Hale said, "History is archived, but memory is smothered." He lifted yellowed news clippings of the Black Knight's silhouette drifting like a bruise above Earth. Headlines hinted at lost signals, vanished astronauts, and denials wrapped in government language. Jonathan Hale said, Every missing line is a confession. Caretaker passed, giving a cautious look that warned more than words. Dust clung to the papers like witnesses afraid to testify. Jonathan Hale said, "Truth grows mold when left underground." The hum of the old microfilm reader stuttered like a dying heart as pages flickered past faces long forgotten. Jonathan Hale said, "They wanted silence, but silence speaks in echoes." His hand trembled, not from fear but anticipation of a wound he had chosen to reopen. The cafe smelled of cinnamon and doubt as Evelyn Cross pushed her tea aside with a sigh. Dr. Evelyn Cross said, "Your obsession will eat you." Jonathan Hale leaned forward, voice low, words sharpened by sleepless nights. Jonathan Hale said, "It is not obsession, it is persistence." She shook her head, weary eyes cutting through his urgency. Dr. Evelyn Cross said, "There are walls built for a reason." Outside, rain smeared the glass in long gray strokes that matched her warning. Jonathan Hale said, "Walls crumble, or they are climbed." She looked at him with the tired patience of someone trying to save a drowning man who swore he could breathe underwater. Dr. Evelyn Cross said, "You chase shadows until they swallow you." He smiled faintly, unbroken. Jonathan Hale said, "Better swallowed than blind." The rain answered with a steady applause for his defiance. The alley smelled of diesel and forgotten promises when Gabriel Noir stepped from shadows like a rumor made flesh. Gabriel Noir said, "You hear whispers too loud for comfort." Jonathan Hale stiffened, but held his ground, knowing riddles often dressed as men. Jonathan Hale said, "What do you want?" Noir's smile was carved in patience, eyes reflecting the glow of a broken street lamp. Gabriel Noir said, "Not what I want. What you are willing to risk." He handed a slip of paper, coordinates scrawled like scars. Jonathan Hale said, "Why help me?" Noir's laugh had no joy, only smoke. Gabriel Noir said, "Because truth needs messengers even if it kills them." The words hung like cold breath in the wet air. Jonathan Hale said, "And the price?" Noir stepped back, swallowed by the night. Gabriel Noir said, "Trust is the only coin left." The coordinates burned hotter than fire in Jonathan's pocket. The meeting hall buzzed faintly with the hum of fluorescent indifference as Samuel Drake joined Jonathan, smile smooth as polished marble. Samuel Drake said, "I found records that may interest you." His tone curled with sincerity too clean to trust. Jonathan Hale said, "Show me." Drake spread blueprints across the table, hands steady, eyes rehearsed. Samuel Drake said, "They want you to chase ghosts, and I will not let you." Jonathan's suspicion sharpened, reading between the lines that were too convenient. Jonathan Hale said, "Truth does not need shepherds." Drake leaned closer, whispering like a priest at confession. Samuel Drake said, "Sometimes truth is poison." The words carried warning but tasted of manipulation. Jonathan kept his mask still, though doubt crawled at his spine. Jonathan Hale said, "Then I will drink it gladly." Drake's smile widened, a craftsman pleased with his trap. The apartment felt smaller with the weight of the files spread like wounds across the floor. Jonathan Hale said, "Each note leads to silence, not answers." He traced coordinates that formed a path across oceans and polar shadows. Jonathan Hale said, "They mark a trail someone wants erased." Evelyn joined by phone, her voice threaded with worry. Dr. Evelyn Cross said, "If this was real, they would not leave breadcrumbs." He countered with the stubbornness of the obsessed. Jonathan Hale said, "Maybe they want someone reckless enough to follow." The wind pressed at the windows as if urging retreat. He lit another lamp, shadows piling higher with the papers. Jonathan Hale said, "If this is a trap, then the bait is irresistible." Outside, a siren wailed, reminding him that danger does not knock. It waits. Night returned like a patient interrogator while the decoder chewed the carrier to ribs. Jonathan Hale said, "Breathe for me." The signal fluttered, then aligned as if embarrassed by its own order. He graphed intervals that mapped a cold procession along polar skies. Jonathan Hale said, "You keep time where clocks freeze." The lattice resolved into angles that kissed ancient star paths and recent launches. He tasted metal in the air, a memory of storms and hospital lights. Dr. Evelyn Cross said, "Patterns tempt zealots." He answered with a tired grin that meant caution was late. Jonathan Hale said, "A mirror only lies if we do." The final render showed a waypoint over water no ship should love. He saved the file with a name that sounded like a dare. The apartment stilled, as if the room had learned to listen. He slipped into a government reading room where silence wore a badge. The clerk stamped forms with the rhythm of a threat. Jonathan Hale said, "I'll need the defunct tracking logs." A terminal blinked awake like a guilty conscience. He found a folder that did not know it was deleted. Jonathan Hale said, "Files survive like weeds." The logs named a phantom object shepherded by human hands. A memo praised discretion with the elegance of a knife. Jonathan Hale said, "Someone curated this absence." He printed pages that smelled of fresh snow and old smoke. A camera near the ceiling clicked without shame. Jonathan Hale said, "Smile for the archives." He walked out with copies that felt heavier than they were. Far uptown, a conference room glittered like a polished alibi. Dr. Marcus Vale reviewed slides that converted doubt into policy. Dr. Marcus Vale said, "We contain narratives by starving them." Advisors nodded with professional hunger. He circled a name that should not be known in those walls. Dr. Marcus Vale said, "Engage friendly experts and generous corrections." A handler listed journalists the way hunters count tracks. Dr. Marcus Vale said, "Leak a decoy so he follows noise." He smiled. A weather system in a suit. Across the city, Jonathan felt a draft that had no window. Jonathan Hale said, "Someone just moved a piece." The game was now official, and the table was not his. The street smelled of hot brakes and fear as a van nosed the crosswalk too fast. Jonathan Hale said, "Not subtle." He stepped back, heel catching on a curb that tried to undo him. The grill flashed like a grin that forgot mercy. A horn split the night and folded fast into silence. Jonathan Hale said, "You missed on purpose." The van idled, then drifted away with the patience of a threat that schedules. He noted the plate and knew it would belong to nobody. Jonathan Hale said, "Accidents prefer paperwork." A cold certainty settled under his ribs where hope used to nap on. He walked on, pretending his hands were not shaking. The city watched, generous with witnesses and stingy with help. The pier creaked like a confession while gulls wrote curses on the wind. She waited by a rusted bollard with a folder hugged to her chest. Clara Bennett said, "I kept this because I could not keep him." The pronoun hit harder than waves. Jonathan Hale said, "Tell me where it hurts." She spoke of a night when a signal stole sleep, and then a life. Clara Bennett said, "He heard music in the static." The folder held logs, photos, and a postcard of stars that never matched the sky. Jonathan Hale said, "You were not meant to carry this alone." She nodded, relief mixed with dread. Clara Bennett said, "Take it before I change my mind." The wind lifted the edges of truth and asked for more. The lab smelled of ozone, and worry as wires trailed like veins across the floor. Evelyn Cross stood over the equipment, her fingers restless but steady. Dr. Evelyn Cross said, "If we push further, they will notice." Jonathan Hale placed the folder on the table, his voice low, eyes feverish. Jonathan Hale said, "They already noticed." She scanned the waveforms, frowning as if truth could bruise. Dr. Evelyn Cross said, "You ask machines to prove ghosts." He leaned closer, lips tight with hunger for validation. Jonathan Hale said, "Ghosts leave fingerprints when you insist." She sighed, frustration coating her resolve. Dr. Evelyn Cross said, "If I help, there is no undoing." His silence was its own agreement. The hum of the decoder swelled, like a secret learning to sing. The Cathedral of Ruins echoed with whispers as Gabriel Noir returned, coat heavy with rain. Gabriel Noir said, "You chase too clean a trail." Jonathan Hale's voice cut the silence like a blade. Jonathan Hale said, "Then dirty it for me." Noir lit a cigarette, smoke spiraling like scripture. Gabriel Noir said, "Your enemy is not the signal but those who tend it." Jonathan bristled, fists tight at his sides. Jonathan Hale said, "Names not riddles." Noir smiled faintly, shadows claiming his face. Gabriel Noir said, "Names burn faster than truth." The coordinates he offered were written on a torn hymn sheet. Jonathan Hale said, "Why trust you?" Noir exhaled smoke that tasted of riddles. Gabriel Noir said, "Because lies do not wear this much weight." Jonathan sat with Evelyn in the archive annex where air smelled of varnish and secrets. Jonathan Hale said, "These edits are no accident." Evelyn scanned the documents, her frown carved deep. Dr. Evelyn Cross said, "They erased with surgical precision." He tapped the redacted paragraphs, voice tight. Jonathan Hale said, "What hides this carefully is too dangerous to ignore." She shook her head, eyes sharp with fear. Dr. Evelyn Cross said, "Or too dangerous to reveal." The pages crackled as if ashamed of their silence. Jonathan Hale said, "Absence is confession wearing gloves." Evelyn leaned back, exhausted but unwilling to walk away. Dr. Evelyn Cross said, "Then we name them by what they deny." Their pact was fragile but forged. The hotel lounge gleamed with false warmth. Samuel Drake, already waiting, smiled smooth as silk. Samuel Drake said, "I warned you, not all friends are real." Jonathan approached, shoulders stiff, voice colder than glass. Jonathan Hale said, "And yet you keep pretending." Drake spread his hands as if absolving himself of crimes. Samuel Drake said, "I give you warnings, you call them lies." Jonathan's glare sharpened, patience thinning. Jonathan Hale said, "Because lies wear costumes like yours." Drake leaned closer, voice honeyed and venomous. Samuel Drake said, "Truth burns worse than betrayal." Jonathan bit back his fury, sensing the trap woven in charm. Jonathan Hale said, "Then let it burn us both." The broadcast newsroom buzzed with machinery of narrative as Dr. Marcus Vale orchestrated the play. Dr. Marcus Vale said, "Discredit before curiosity grows teeth." Assistants typed, spinning denial into fact. Jonathan Hale, hidden in the crowd, watched the man who shaped silence. Jonathan Hale said, "Control smiles before it strangles." Vale adjusted his tie, face unreadable, voice calm thunder. Dr. Marcus Vale said, "We starve myths by feeding certainty." A young reporter raised doubts, but her words were trimmed mid-sentence. Jonathan clenched his jaw, rage sharpening his clarity. Jonathan Hale said, "He builds cages and calls them truths." The cameras blinked, catching a world rehearsed to trust the wrong face. Clara's apartment kept the kind of quiet that remembers storms. She cleared a space on the table and set the folder down like a fragile animal. Clara Bennett said, "I kept pieces because whole truths were hunted." He met her gaze and steadied the air between them. Jonathan Hale said, "Tell me what broke first." She touched a photograph where a smile used to live. Clara Bennett said, "He chased the voice in the static and never came back." The words trembled, but did not fall. Jonathan Hale said, "What did the voice promise?" She stared at the recorder and flinched at silence. Clara Bennett said, "It sang coordinates and called his name." He gathered the pages as if they were bones. Jonathan Hale said, "We will make a body of this." The storage unit smelled of dust and resignation as they lifted a crate marked with a name that mattered. Jonathan Hale said, "Elena kept everything." They found star charts stitched with dates that hurt to read. And Dr. Evelyn Cross said, "These align with the polar passes." He unfolded a letter soft with regret and ghosts. Jonathan Hale said, "She wrote about a melody inside the noise." A photo showed Elena beside an antenna she built like a prayer. Dr. Evelyn Cross said, "She was mapping a language." He traced a note in the margin that matched his lattice. Jonathan Hale said. She reached the satellite before anyone admitted it existed. The room seemed to lean toward the proof. Dr. Evelyn Cross said. Then someone pulled her into the dark. The campus network room hummed like a hive that forgot the queen. Evelyn keyed a code that would cost her sleep and tenure. Dr. Evelyn Cross said, I am borrowing time from people who hoard it. He watched the progress bar climb like a distressed hymn. Jonathan Hale said, we only need 6 minutes of courage. Logs poured into a drive with the urgency of witnesses. Dr. Evelyn Cross said, these are ground station captures they buried. Footsteps echoed in the hall with official certainty. Jonathan Hale said, finish and I will stall. She nodded, jaw set against doubt. Dr. Evelyn Cross said, if this dam breaks, it is on both of us. He smiled without comfort. Jonathan Hale said, I never liked dry shoes anyway. They met under a bridge where secrets learn to echo. Michael arrived late, smile stitched from older days. Michael Hale said, I heard you finally found her trail. Jonathan tasted metal and memory. Jonathan Hale said, I found your footprints on it. He offered a flash drive dressed as salvation. Michael Hale said, this will clear the smoke. The gift felt prearranged and gently poisoned. Jonathan Hale said, who paid for your help? His brother looked away, breaking eye contact like a pack. Michael Hale said, I kept you alive when others would not. The wind carried a siren that answered for them both. Jonathan Hale said, you kept me busy while they cleaned the scene. The raid came dressed in procedure and kindness that bruises slowly. Agents moved through the lab with boxes and clipped apologies. Dr. Marcus Vale said, compliance protects everyone. Jonathan felt the floor tilt and chose anger over gravity. Jonathan Hale said, truth does not need escort services. Evelyn stepped between the drives and the careful hands. Dr. Evelyn Cross said, these are public records by any honest measure. Vale's smile did not change temperature. Dr. Marcus Vale said, honesty is a term of art. A recorder on the table watched with a blind red eye. Jonathan Hale said, you starve fires and then blame the ash. The boxes closed like mouths. The room forgot how to hum. The warehouse smelled of salt and rust, where secrecy preferred the dark. Jonathan placed the stolen files on a crate and lit a small lamp. Jonathan Hale said, these logs confirm launches no one admitted. Evelyn scanned the lines, her breath catching on coordinates. Dr. Evelyn Cross said, these align with the same orbit as your lattice. He drew a circle on the map, hands shaking but sure. Jonathan Hale said, it was not born of chance but of intent. The documents whispered a design older than headlines. Jonathan Hale said, a machine to watch us before we could watch ourselves. The hum of the sea outside agreed with no one. Evelyn folded the pages, her face lined with dread. Dr. Evelyn Cross said, you are chasing something not human. The subway tunnel groaned like an old lung as Gabriel Noir emerged from the shadow, eyes reflecting the weak glow of a failing bulb. Gabriel Noir said, you're closer than you know, but closer is dangerous. Jonathan's hand hovered near his coat, not in fear but habit. Jonathan Hale said, then tell me what waits at the end. Noir handed him a battered notebook wrapped in oilcloth. Gabriel Noir said, read the margins, not the text. Evelyn frowned, suspicion etched on her voice. Dr. Evelyn Cross said, why should we trust you now? Noir exhaled, the smoke curling like a broken map. Gabriel Noir said, because even liars can't fake weight this heavy. Jonathan opened the book and saw equations carved like prayers. Jonathan Hale said, this is not theory, it is instruction. Jonathan worked the equations like wounds, each line bleeding meaning. His notes spread across the apartment floor, wires tangled with coffee cups. Jonathan Hale said, it is a broadcast protocol, not noise. He replayed recordings aligning bursts with cosmic maps. Jonathan Hale said, it repeats orbital decay as if teaching us a language. His chest tightened with memory of lullabies turned into static. He traced symbols that matched scars of his childhood dreams. Jonathan Hale said, "I have been hearing this for years without knowing." Evelyn entered quietly, her voice soft but edged. Dr. Evelyn Cross said, "This is not discovery, it is possession." He did not answer, only circled the final line. Jonathan Hale said, "The voice was meant for me." Dr. Marcus Vale stood in a polished office, skyline bleeding dusk behind glass. Dr. Marcus Vale said, "Containment is failing. We escalate." His aides waited like statues carved from silence. He tapped a file stamped with Jonathan's name. Dr. Marcus Vale said, "Make him a warning, not a martyr." Outside, storm clouds gathered like judgment. He lifted a phone, tone steady as steel. Dr. Marcus Vale said, "Activate the contingency." A shadow in the corner whispered compliance without words. Vale's reflection stared back with a smile colder than the glass. Jonathan Hale said elsewhere, "He is tightening the noose." The city felt smaller by the second. The warehouse floor shook as metal doors crashed open. Armed men poured in with faces of procedure. Jonathan shoved Evelyn behind a crate. Jonathan Hale said, "They chose force over silence." Bullets chewed wood, splinters like angry confetti. Evelyn hissed, clutching the notebook to her chest. Dr. Evelyn Cross said, "They want the book, not us." Jonathan reloaded with hands steady, but eyes burning. Jonathan Hale said, "Then they get nothing." The air reeked of gunpowder and betrayal as shadows shifted. A figure stepped forward, Michael with regret carved deep. Michael Hale said, "I never wanted it this way." Jonathan's voice cracked, but did not break. Jonathan Hale said, "You wanted it exactly this way." The storm broke into ragged ribbons as the array woke to the sea's cold breath. Jonathan Hale said, "Power the dish and lock the bearing." The notebook's margins aligned like teeth in a patient clock. Dr. Evelyn Cross said, "If this summons anything, we cannot unsummon it." He keyed the sequence, hands steady from practice and fear. Jonathan Hale said, "Teach me what you meant to teach." The carrier rose thin as a violin string and gathered courage. Gabriel Noir said, "You are about to learn why maps have edges." The signal folded into a grammar of primes, then bloomed. Jonathan Hale said, "It is not calling Earth, it is calling a mirror." The wind pressed the walls as if eavesdropping grew heavy. Dr. Evelyn Cross said, "Record everything, even what hurts to keep." The dish held its posture like a lighthouse aimed at history. The playback began with room tone and a shy cough that time forgot. Elena Torres said, "If you hear this, I crossed a line they drew in fog." The tape crackled like fire learning a new word. Jonathan Hale said, "She knew the code before we did." She described a test, a relay, and a lie that wore a flag. Dr. Evelyn Cross said, "They built a veil and used her to stitch it." Elena Torres said, "I sent the key inside a lullaby of orbits." Her breath hitched as footsteps entered her memory. Elena Torres said, "If I vanish, make it loud." Silence fell with the weight of a verdict. Jonathan Hale said, "She is the map and the cost." The machine clicked, empty again, leaving the room smaller and colder. They argued in whispers that still sounded like thunder. Dr. Evelyn Cross said, "Truth without context is a blade." Jonathan Hale paced the length of the room like a metronome that forgot mercy. Jonathan Hale said, "Secrets are the wound that never clots." She spread the risks across the table like weather maps. Dr. Evelyn Cross said, "Panic will bloom faster than wonder." He set the notebook down, choosing a sentence that cost sleep. Jonathan Hale said, "We publish the protocol and her message, unedited." The air grew bright with consequence. Dr. Evelyn Cross said, "Then we stand with it when it falls." He nodded, vows settling like dust after a collapse. Jonathan Hale said, "We answer the mirror with our true face." The plan felt inevitable and newly born. They met Vale beneath studio lights that turned motives to chrome. Dr. Marcus Vale said, You will trade awe for disorder. Jonathan Hale stood with the calm that arrives after choosing. Jonathan Hale said, "Disorder already hired you as its press agent." The control room hushed, scent of ozone and ambition. Dr. Marcus Vale said, "I built quiet so fear would sleep." Evelyn held up Elena's voice like a lantern. Dr. Evelyn Cross said, "Your quiet, murdered questions." He reached for the feed and found it locked open to the world. And Jonathan Hale said, "We borrowed your stage and gave it purpose." Vale's smile cracked on a fault line years in the making. Dr. Marcus Vale said, "History forgives architects." The red lights stayed on, and the truth marched out in uniform. Night returned, not as cover but as audience, while the dish sang back. The sky answered with a chorus of primes braided into a star map. Jonathan Hale said, "It is offering a rendezvous, not a throne." The pattern unfolded toward an orbit past the moon where tides forget us. Dr. Evelyn Cross said, "It wanted a species that could hear patterns in storms." He thought of Elena and the cost of a single key. Jonathan Hale said, "We carry her name in every packet." The signal softened, then nested itself in silence like trust. Cities blinked awake to a new grammar of sky. Dr. Evelyn Cross said, "We are no longer alone, and never were." The dish kept its vigil, and the future widened like a door.